Are you frustrated with the overall effect, the overall look of your ink drawings? Perhaps they always look, I don't know, in some way a bit hard to put your finger on, just a bit too simplified or slick or underfinished in some way compared to life, or that perhaps you've got lost in drawing details, trying to make them look more lifelike, more realistic, and it's just done the opposite. Let me focus on these two issues in this demo and explain with my drawing technique how I avoid, I think, those things happening for my drawing and being able to capture at the end, overall, a reasonably realistic look drawing with an ink pen. And let me say, I'm firstly assuming that you're able to get perspective angles correct, overall proportions, that they're okay, that your shape, your scale, and your proportions are all relatively good. Because obviously, if any of those things are a big problem, then our drawings aren't going to look particularly realistic. But if you're interested in this demo, then you've probably come to realize that you can get those things at least mostly right, or even completely right all the time. And somehow, despite this accuracy, the drawing still looks somehow not real. That there's more to it than just accurate shapes and angles. So let me, now that we have a bit here to look at, start talking you through what it is about my drawing technique that I think avoids this problem. And I think part of it lies in the fact that when I actually put the ink on the paper, I draw relatively quickly. Now, let me tell you that this is at double speed. So this 31-minute video took me just a few minutes over 1 hour to draw in actual time. And I think it really would be helpful if at some point relatively early on, you slow the video speed that you're watching now down to half speed using the settings, that cog icon that you can see. That's a way of being able to control the speed. And that will just give you a sense of how fast, when I say fast, it actually is. And the good thing about watching actual time is it does also slow down the gaps and also helps you to understand the amount of time I still need to give to pausing, observing my reference, and then observing the blank parts of my paper and working out the best point to put a mark. Now, the reason I said that a fairly brisk drawing pace I think is helpful for a sense of realism is that what it means is the lines and the marks we make are not very even, which may sound odd, but I've come to realize that often what makes our drawings look a bit stylized when we draw with ink, or even cartoon-like, is when we draw a bit slower, and so the lines that we create all flow with an evenness. They tend to be quite smooth, and they tend to be the same thickness throughout the whole length. When we look at an object in life, we don't normally have that heavily defined outline area. And it's partly just what's actually there, and it's partly the way we look at something. When we look at something, even if it is fairly smooth edged, like let's take, for instance, the veranda post closest to us in the neighbouring house, that dark green one. Well, that is fairly smooth, but in some way it's not actually a hard, sharp corner. It's a squared off corner, but if we were to put a hand on it, we wouldn't cut it. It's actually got a roundedness both from the actual timber and then also the slightly increasingly smooth effect of the paint going over that. And so a really hard, smooth line creates a starkness, a rigidity and a heaviness that's just not there in life. And it's the same for the line that comes down between the two silhouette edges of this dark green pillar. The line in between, we almost don't see, but we're going to need to draw it. And if I draw a heavy black line down there, I'm creating visually an effect that's way stronger and even different to what we have in life. Again, this is a rounded edge, not a sharp edge. It's a rounded edge that catches the light in different ways. And in some senses, the amount of light that's caught on each side of this rounded edge differs from top to bottom, and therefore a range of ink marks as we come down that is helpful. I mean, look at the outside line I've drawn at this point for that dark column. And you can see it's a pale line because I've drawn it quickly and I've drawn it holding the pen very lightly against the paper. And that lets me leave a lot less ink. And it's also hard to control the evenness of the flow the faster I go, because some parts are done a little bit faster and some a little bit slower. It's not as if it's actually a super even movement as well. So if you look at all the lines, and by lines I simply mean lines that are kind of a centimetre or more long. If you look at all the lines, you'll see that there's great variety in the if you like, lineness of them. Some of those lines are so quickly and lightly drawn that there's gaps of paper coming through. In others, there's not really gaps of paper coming through, but the ink sits heavier on the tooth of this paper. This is a 210 GSM drawing cartridge made by an Australian brand, Arctec, although it is a German paper that they import into Australia and bind into sketchbooks. It's the one I like for ink drawing. It is generally waterproof, but the tooth I don't think is strong enough for satisfactory watercolour, but it is quite good for marker work as well and ink work. So, and now you see I've just done those tops of the tree marks firmer and got a more even effect with the ink, because I'm trying to create contrast in the way the ink sits on the paper between different things as well, because that happens in life. And in some ways, if maybe a good way to simplify my approach and possibly the problem you might be having is, if our problem is that our lines look too smooth and simplified, so that starts to introduce an unwanted cartoon-like look, the way around that is to introduce a roughness into our lines and unevenness into the ink flow. Now, I know stylistically this isn't going to be what some of you want, and particularly if you're moving into a more deliberately stylized drawing technique or into the anime or black and white comic world, cartoon world, then you're going to want to have, in all likelihood, that sleekness, that slickness and that evenness, because that will be part of the overall sort of visual sense that you want of representing what's happening and of presenting to the degree that the illustrations present the story that's happening. But if we're drawing a real life scene, then we're wanting to capture something that is invariably not so sleek, not so slick, not so even, something that is a bit rougher. Hope this makes sense. It's my first time I've actually tried to articulate this. I've been thinking about it vaguely for a number of months. But I think, as I said, this is my first chance of trying to say it. And look, if you're thinking it's helpful, please hit the like button for me. If you're thinking this might give you some things that you can try to focus on in your mark making. And I think, again, this is where, as I've said in many videos now, this is where seeing our drawing process as happening through marks rather than lines is very helpful, because I think it's easier when we think marks to think of a variety of marks done in a variety of ways. But when we think about lines, it's easy to think, well, we're drawing lines in the way that perhaps in school we would draw geometry shapes in maths or in art, or when we did draw pictures in school when we were younger, they really were an outline of a heavy continuous line in most cases for most of us. And so that naturally flows into our thinking when we think of drawing. We draw with lines and we outline shapes, and so lines mean nice, smooth, even lines. In fact, we probably end up thinking that the longer and smoother and more even they are, the better our drawing, the more realistic our drawing is going to look. And that need not be the case at all. If we look at the edges, if we look at all the things that are in this drawing that we're going to represent with a line, they're often very different things. Some of them are edges that are sharper, and some of them are edges that actually are rounded. If we look at these columns, what we're drawing with a line is actually a cylinder, but we're using that same line to draw the squared column that's green, dark green, that's closest to us. If we look at the lines of the brickwork that are stained dark between the window and the front door of the house, we can see there's a lot of variety in the thickness there. Haven't done them yet, but pay attention when I do. If we look at the leaf litter on the ground, how do we draw that? Well, the leaf litter is a good example of trying to capture the effect of detail, not the actual detail. So pay attention to that. But also look now at the paving stones on the porch, on the veranda. Have a look in the photo, sorry. Now, we don't see strong black lines surrounding all the stones, but it's so easy to start to outline those pavers on our drawing because, well, they're shapes that we can see. But when we look at this, we can see some lines where the pavers have shifted and there's a shadow being cast, or there's a bit of shade on one edge. We see those more heavily, but then that line is often broken if there's a leaf or something in the way. And on other sides, because the light is bouncing differently, we don't see any line at all. So in fact, it's not helpful if we're thinking of lines to outline these paving stones. It's better to look at what we're seeing, understand what we're seeing, and I don't mean understand what it is in some theoretical brand new shape, but how it is here with these rounded edges of flagging stones that are all tipped at different angles. The leaves are accumulating in different parts according to the uneven surface or where they're stopped, such as at the brick wall. And again, talking about that, look at the bottom of the brick wall and see all the leaves that have blown up against it. What does that do to the line that we would draw there? You'll notice I didn't draw a line there, did I? No, because that wouldn't visually have created the effect of that part of the drawing, of the photo, of the reference. No, in fact, it's a very broken sense of where the house stops and the flagging stones come out. And because there are all those leaves there, and the leaves are very small at this distance, they're further away than the closest leaves that we can see more clearly, we're really just catching some of the shadows under the leaves or between them, rather than even seeing the leaves. If we were to take the colour out of this, so get rid of that yellowy beige and the browny out of the leafy part, then they would become even less obvious what was happening. And the shadows, just the places where the dark values are there, would stand out more as just a lot of little dots. And that's what we can draw with our pen. We stop trying to draw a line, an artificial line that we somehow think is there, because we haven't actually looked carefully enough to see that that's not what we get. It's all about putting marks on the paper that create the effect of what we see. Now, look at what I'm doing now. I'm doing some leaves, and you'll notice that a couple of leaves I'll draw relatively carefully, but in other parts I'm not. I'm just adding a bit of, in effect, dot work and dash work and just getting some crisscrossing angles with those. Again, these bricks that are set into the footpath here. I'm not doing them with careful lines drawn around the outside shape. I'm putting my marks on the paper for those bricks so that some parts are darker than others, and that reflects, if we look in the photo, that some bricks, the same as the pavers, are up higher, some are lower, and because of the angle of the sun as well, are in shade or reflect in shadow differently to other parts of the bricks around them. Now here we have these sandstone edging pieces, and they're very weathered and very rounded. Now again, there's approximately a line where we stop seeing them, but that line is very rounded. Again, it's not like a hard, sharp, metal cube that's been refined and polished and exactly 90 degrees at a nice crisp hard edge, which is often what a black line there, relatively slowly drawn for a nice careful even finish, is going to create a very different feel when we look at it to what we see here. In fact, we don't even see a line really on the upper side of those sandstone pieces. We see a line between them and under them, but it's more than a line in this case, because it's the shaded and it's the shaded area and the shadow that the shaded area casts that we're seeing that creates a dark value. See, we're not really, in most cases here, drawing shapes, we're drawing values. And those values don't necessarily have a hard edge. Well, now we have a lot of leaves that are really too far away to see as leaves. So I need just to create this massive little dark patches, which, as I said before, is really not so much the leaves, but where a leaf is slightly off the ground and casting a shadow. And that shadow reads far more strongly than the colour difference between the leaf and the ground. If in fact we were to desaturate the photo, take the colour out, turn it into a black and white photo, the difference between the brown of the leaves and the grey of the gravelly surface underneath would not be nearly as strong as we have in our photo. So this is what we're trying to do. Now, this next part is a good example of finding marks of various texture and width and straightness to capture something that we see in our photo, that we see in life, that would be far less realistic looking if we were to simply draw the straight lines that we see. And if we look particularly at where those brick lines are darker, now I assume that it's maybe at some point they've been pointed with a different concrete, or perhaps that Charles just smeared some mud in there at some point. I'm not sure why they look like that. But if we look at it, it's a good example to see. It would be so tempting just to draw a straight line there, just to draw a black line with our pen on our photo, on our drawing, from that part of the photo. But when we look carefully at these dark lines, we can see that they're not even. There's not a consistent darkness from one end to the other. There's a fuzziness of the edges, particularly the further away they go, that some parts have a darkness that other parts don't. And these are all visual cues that give our brain information about what we're looking at. And of course, it also gives our brain information that this is something I've seen before, that I see all the time. This is what real life looks like. But when on my drawing, I capture that with continuous, straight, smooth lines that are even thickness the whole length, that are evenly dark, that just look very even and the same and geometric, I'm not creating the effect of what I'm seeing in life or in the photo. And that's why what I've drawn starts to look less realistic. Now, let's have a look at another spot where you might have been tempted to draw a straight line. And that's on the right-hand side of that main doorway, that dark green doorway, which is, as well as being a dark colour, is also in shadow from the porch, from the veranda section. Now, it would have been easy to have drawn a nice, clean, straight line straight down there. And while that wouldn't have looked as unhelpful perhaps, or as unrealistic as doing a straight line along the bottom where all the leaves have brushed up against the base of the window wall, it still would have given a hard, sharp, smooth edge to what still has a bit of a rounded look to it, because the brickwork was not absolutely sharp. It's weathered a bit and it's been painted probably many times, which also dulls the sharpness of the corner. Plus we have the situation that in between the bricks, in where the courses of mortar or cement are, there's often a slight indent on the corner where the mortar is just edged back slightly. And while that may not obviously jump out, sometimes it does, but it may not obviously jump out, as is the case here, it still helps to create a bit of a softening of how that edge looks. And so what I've done here, in what I've done so far, is to keep my options open by doing a reasonably light line with a soft effect, with a soft edge, because I don't want to make it strong and stark and bold and the same from top to bottom, because that's not what's happening. As that edge moves upwards, it becomes, if you like, softer, blurrier, because of the darker values that start to overtake it, because it gets the shade and the shadow get darker as we move further up the wall. There's less light bouncing up into those parts. So now I've kind of reached the point where I need to work out, where am I going to strengthen parts of this? I don't necessarily mean where am I going to do long, sharp, smooth, continuous, even lines, though I might, in some places, if I think that's going to be helpful for the overall feel of realism. But I'm certainly not presuming that. And just look what I'm doing up here, trying to get the effect of that tiled roof at this angle. I'll do a bit more work on that in a moment. It's all about not so much any one mark, but all the marks we pile on top of each other, how they read in relation to each other. And so a line that, if I just drew it on the paper, may not look very sharp and even and continuous. If the marks around it are less so, then that mark or that line is going to look far more like that. So it's not as straightforward as we might think. So now, trying to create that slightly rippled effect almost up that edge. And as you can see, I haven't actually even been particularly precise in how I've done that ridging between the cornice tiles that go down on that edge. Really, I've been more concerned about really hammering home the fact that it's not a straight line, it's not a smooth line. And I've used a series of marks to create a certain effect, because I also know that that's not where people's eyes are going to be going. Their eyes are going to be going to the darker areas and the more central, more obvious elements. They're going to go to the entrance to the house, because house entrances draw our eyes always, because that's where we go. That's where we go in. That's the place of connection with a house from outside to inside. And so that also means we should pay particular attention to those. Now, you'll look here, I'm doing the value for this hedging in the neighbour's house, very dark, because that lets me create some edges in my house part without actually drawing much at all, because it's going to be the shadows behind that create the edge, and that gives me options as well. If you were to zoom in on any one part of this porch area, it would just look a mess. But as we pull back and we read those marks in context, the fact that I haven't outlined really any of those elements of the under the veranda, or the stone in, flag in, and the leaf litter on it, I haven't really outlined much at all. And what I have has been with very variable lines. Yet together, it actually, I think, reads really successfully. I always thought that ground was going to be a challenge when I started to draw this, and I think it was. Please hit that like button for me if you find this interesting. I do have a playlist on drawing the effective detail, not drawing the actual detail, and that does, I think, overlap with this an awful lot, because it's trying to outline detail rather than find marks to capture the effect of that detail, which also creates a real unrealistic look, and sometimes a cartoon-like or children's book illustration effect. If we substitute an effective way of, say, drawing leaves for a pattern, which in our mind is the best we can do to represent leaves. It's all a way of thinking. How we draw is not nearly as much about knowing the right drawing techniques as about understanding a drawing process, the one that we want, the one that we need to create the sorts of drawings that we want to have at the end of our drawing session. So my drawing process isn't going to be particularly helpful if you want to have an anime, slick black and white, sleek, sharp edges, strong contrast everywhere finish. Some of my principles may be helpful, but it certainly won't all be. But if you want your drawings to look like mine, then my way of understanding what I'm doing is going to be helpful, because it's my understanding of my process of drawing that guides me into how to draw. Putting these little black marks on the paper is not particularly hard to do. There's a little bit of skill in learning to control the pens we use to do lines of different weight and marks of different weight, to get all we can, to get all the variety we can out of our pen. But really, it's then knowing how we use that. And that comes from our understanding of the process. And I've often talked how I see this as translating one visual language into another, the visual language of the photo into the visual language of the pen on paper. Now, look at what I'm doing now. Look how I didn't draw a hard, smooth line for that lower tree trunk. And just imagine if I had, how it wouldn't have sat in the background as, I think, successfully as it does here. Because I don't want this tree to suddenly become the clearest, most obvious thing we see, which it would if I'd drawn it very smoothly and sharply and evenly. It would have stood out in a way that would have been unhelpful. And again, look at this veranda that's closest to us, this corner of the veranda. Look how much variation there is in my lines there, where I have drawn lines, because lines are a good way of representing what I'm doing. I didn't put the mesh in. I decided that was, again, going to be too complicated and would draw attention down there in a way I didn't want it to. So, but for what I have drawn, and for the actual column post, just again, imagine if I'd done heavier, stronger lines, they wouldn't have sat within the overall context of the drawing so well, so comfortably. It's all about not just the mark, but the mark in relation to all the other marks, the lights and darks that we create. So now I am though emphasizing a few, which will also help with the perception of depth. So I probably shouldn't have done that one as strongly. I was just thinking how nicely that closest column feels closer than the far one, and then I did something very similar to the far one, and I think it's slightly less effective now. I think what I should have done was done what I did, but as in emphasize those outlines, but not as strongly as I did for the far column. What do you think? Love to hear in the column. Please hit that like button if you haven't already. And at this point now, I'm just thinking, is there anything more that needs done to tweak the overall appearance to help just get the values? And this is often where we tweak the values. We tweak the shade in the shadows that we've created through hatching. We just darken one bit a little bit more. I think I'm yet to darken the doorway slightly, and I think that really helps. So just keep watching. See what you think when I put just at the very end a little more darkness in that doorway, just particularly at the top, and I think it really helps it to pop. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. What do you think? No, I think I've already done that. Well, I hope you give this a go. I'll provide a link. No, here it goes. I provide a link to this photo in the description. Why not have a go drawing it yourself? But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. Do you agree? That works better. The very last thing I did. I'll see you next video. Bye.